This is Miguel Ángel Vargas, theater director and art historian, and I'm gonna talk about Romani performing art. Speaking on Romani performing art seemed to be a very big task because we had to consider 1,000 years of history. In my case, being a Spanish Roma Gitano linked to flamenco and theater, it's important to make clear that my perspective is informed by the contradictions and debates around flamenco. Even if I talk about international Romani performing art, I will do it from the perspective of being a Spanish Gitano. Talking about international Romani performing art help us raising the question of when can we speak of Romani performing art, help us build an international reading of the different examples of our history that goes back to 1,000 years of history. So before modernity until 21st century. And this history is even sometimes beyond Roma characters in non-Roma plays. It's even beyond the theater building itself. It would accomplish many different examples. So speaking on this international Romani approach to Romani performing art, would open a variety of examples. If we want to build a history of theater, then we have to be aware that that might be a correlation of different facts or event that somehow are just a memory of something that has been felt, seen, heard in an exceptional moment. These moments are also transmitted through a trace in a written form and sometimes even an image. If we want to talk about the history of the Roma in theater, we have to be careful because 1,000 years of history might have dealt with vast data of theater fiction on the Gypsy character. When we talk about Romani performing art, instead of focusing on specifically theater, we do so with the intention of promoting a paradigmatic change in the vision of our history. The perspective I'm going to offer will be divided into 3 sections: the Roma paradigm of Romani performing art, the narrative of the origins, and the Gypsy fantasy of modernity, followed by some conclusions and open questions. I will use the metaphor of the Romani path, not to follow the romantic vision we have been taught, but to be able to explain some of the very different Romani theatrical experiences on one side or the other of the path. We find the 2 ways of presenting ourselves, of appearing, of being present. On one side of the road are the public artistic discourses of modernity, and on the other side of the road is the function of one's art in one's community as a form of recognition and as a form of being. What is inside and outside of modernity as a context of the social performativity of Roma identities is reflected on the sources. Regarding what is done inside the Roma community, there is, in theory, no documented testimony. Beyond the historical concatenation of data and the ultimate position that the episodes relating to Roma performing art tend to have within the general history of Roma, we agree, among others, with Dr. Adrian Marsh that the academic research of 18th and 19th centuries have marked the periodization to which the history of Roma is usually subjected. Not only the chronology, but the mere classification of genres or performative experiences is organized, mentioned, analyzed, and classified insofar as customs, folklore, or even art, authentic or not. Therefore, the need to question other people's chronologies and create our own, the task remains of connecting, for example, the periodization proposed by Dr. Ian Hancock, divided into 4 moments: the Telyaripe, the beginning, the departure from India; Nakipe, the march, journey from Asia to Europe; Arecipe, the arrival into Byzantine Europe; and Bujaripe, the installation in Europe. We can use that periodization and combining it later with the one that would continue with the chronology that the different researchers of the modernity and coloniality group use to explain the configuration of the world from 1500 to 2000. The path we were talking about is one in which we witness together the decentralization of the European centers of power toward the Atlantic space and the development of the colonial pattern of power, as Aníbal Quijano says, which implies other elements beyond social class, the exploitation of work that are racism, sexism, and fundamentally knowledge epistemicide. In short, the time of the Roma is also necessarily different on one side or the other of the road and of the stage, in the theatrical building rectangle or in the party circle, in fiction or in affirmation. We could therefore say, simplifying, that we would have a period before modernity which goes from the life in that Indian neighborhood in Ghazna, the capital of the Ghaznavi Empire, to the complex ethnic and social mosaic of pre-Ottoman or Ottoman society, with its Romani puppeteers and purveyors of folk tales. Then we would have the long passage through Europe with its obsessive theatrical presence, and then finally we would arrive in the 20th century with the theatrical projects of Romani Emancipation. The questioning of narratives of origin in current academic research has yet to find a way to explain and answer the multiple demands that continue to be raised from the public and internal performativity of Roma artists. That is to say, on the one hand, we have the trope of the journey of the Roma through music as an element of theatrical demand. It has become a commonplace in the repertoires of many Roma artists and theater companies. Still, it is also true that in the multiple processes of emancipation reflected in the theater, there is a need to connect with this common past, which have certainly become resignified. Still, they are also part of the traditional legacies. It is very tempting to explain yourself by building a genealogy that connects you with the past to articulate discourses of group belonging. This is when the differences arise in the Romani world in the way of relating to rituality on one side or the other side of the road, as a way of connecting, as Mircea Eliade would say, to an illo tempore, to an already unknown past that is imagined with performative images built to be revived. Modernity will make this an obsession and break, as Roma people see it and live it, the secret of the circle, creating a false passage from the ritual to the stage on the other side of the road. The Roma theatrical experiences documented, that is, of true Roma that participates in theatrical events where Gypsy characters are interpreted, speak to us about survival strategies, negotiation of public identity and resistance, even despite that unintended exposure. As the intersection of audience interests, the Roma ritual and the theatrical ritual are always tensely connected and alive to each other. We can see that the identities represented on a stage in fictional interaction and the space of frontal relationship with the audience sometimes contrast with other forms of exposure to the sensory narrative. What is done within the community in its theatrical rituality is influence what is done on stage. Modernity does not reflect the Roma reality on stage, but Roma reality does reflect the fantasy of modernity. The project of modernity that began around 1500 is the one that establishes the rules of the game and life and on stage with which we continue to live. What should we include in the history of Romani performing art? Only those plays, theatrical manifestations that we are certain are by Roma people? Should we consider part of our repertoires in almost all the languages of European countries works with Roma Gypsy characters? We usually analyze Roma's image in the history of art, that is, painting, sculpture, and so on, almost with an eye of anthropological reconstruction. The dresses, the gestures, the poses, but we do not normally think that these images are just reflections of theatrical manifestations, shows. The great compilation of Roma in literature and the theatrical texts as part of literature typically show us how the machine of producing differences, as Mignolo would say, works within the parameters of the internal colonial difference of the empires of Europe. Jews and Roma become internally colonized in Europe, the barbarians among us, whose public images show the gain of rejection of the authorities and the public's attraction. Outside the theater building, we find Roma artists participating in numerous public shows and events. They are specialists in animals and acrobatics, be they in religious theatrical as well-known dancers, or royal masquerades as part of the discourses of the ethnic diversity of the European empires. The privileged position of some Roma artists gives legitimacy to the policies that favor the nationalization of Roma as part of the machinery of exploitation. The contrast, not always reflected in the stage, is set by the slavery situation of the jesters in Romania or the Gitanos in Spain in 1749. The Gypsy festival on stage changed with the arrival of the Enlightenment and the reaction of the new national bourgeoisie. The fantasy of gypsy life haunts Europe and America alike, and the narrative of the backburners of authentic Roma is exported to world exhibitions. The usurpation of memory is then total on the stage. The repetition of the gypsy theatrical imaginary through photography and engravings establishes the framework in which the Roma identity moves in public discourse. Art matters, but Roma lives not. Let's take the example of flamenco dancer's performance Juana Vargas La Macarrona at the Universal Exhibition in Paris in 1889 as part of a company of Spanish gitanas. Almost all of these women were professionals who made a living in the cafés cantantes, performance venues in the main Spanish cities at the time. They were city Roma, somehow proletarians, but the organization of the Paris event saw fit to design a space for authentic Gitano art to be developed. For this, the scenery of a cave is designed and built. Fires, natures, rivers, for artists who have to sell the cruelty joy of Gitanismo or Bohemianism or any other of the thousand names of gypsy fashion. The refuge in the public manifestation of faith, mostly Catholic in the case of Spain, through the participation or creation of religious brotherhoods, is understood as the articulation of strategies of claiming citizenship after traumatic episodes of persecution. The theatrical and logistical knowledge of religious rituality thus demonstrates an understanding of the techniques of organizing space and time. Again, the path of the theatrical journey finds a crossroad from which otherness can be lived. Roma, who specialize in public shows with animals, tend to have similar treatment. Gitano bullfighting or the Ursari in Romania, from the limits of the non-fictional representation of the direct relationship with domesticated nature, promote a form of acceptance of Roma ritual in public spaces. The extreme experiences, the horror, and the attraction to the abyss, blood, and death draw performativity of the Roma aesthetic experience that from Orientalism connect directly with modern art and the avant-garde. All these accumulated experiences, shared many times in world exhibitions in 19th century, international tours of Romani artists during 20th century, and the emergence of Roman intelligentsia in countries like Russia, marked the way after the consequences of World War II and the processes of the colonization and political reorganization of the blocs to the theatrical experiences linked to processes of cultural emancipation. Théâtre Romain, Roma Théâtre Pralipé, Diballo Romatán, La Cuadra de Sevilla, flamenco artists like Mario Maya, Fernanda Romero, and many more are related to multiple and diverse Romani theatrical projects which articulate a contemporary Roma identity. The limits of the gypsy fantasy of modernity are continually questioned. The complaint and the struggle become part of the repertoire, although we must establish that the institutionalization of many of these artistical projects, due to the lack of control of the agendas and because of the way they are constructed within the policies of promotion of national identities, has contributed to a withdrawal of the possibilities of creating new imaginaries. The decline and disappearance of many of these emancipatory theatrical projects has resulted, on the one hand, in the exacerbation of community performance Romani spaces, and on the other, in the reappearance of disruptive Roma discourses. Both of them speak to us of the need to get out of the limits of the role that we have been given to represent in the public space and continue creating new spaces of our control. There is a historical episode which is crucial to understand why flamenco became so known, why the international image of Spain got linked to that of flamenco and Gitanos. Does it flamenco means Gitano, Roma? Is it something particularly Gitano? Or is it something more complicated? From 1749 to 1765, the total population of Spanish Roma were put in prison in what is called Prisión General de Gitanos, the general imprisonment of Gitanos. That episode, which lasted for 16 years, in which the Gitano population of Spain was enslaved and men separated of the women and children. They were used as part of the force to build the new Spanish fleet. The question for me is how that episode affected the public image of Roma. We are told that obviously this black episode of the history of Roma affected mainly firstly to the Roma themselves. Most of them, if not all, were sedentary Roma in Spain at the time, in 1749. But when they left, when they were relieved, they have to endure really hard conditions because they lost everything. But surprisingly enough, when they left, when they were relieved, they found that the image of the Gitanos had become the symbol of a new fashion, kind of a new revolt. And to understand that would mean that we will have to go through the reasons behind this operation. So it's not only a racist operation, so it's not only explained by the racist attitude of the Spanish authorities of the time, but there is something else. And that something else is a reaction against the Enlightenment politicians. So that operation was part of a wider movement in which they were trying to build a new state. Spain was divided into different kingdoms, a single king, but at the time they had different administration for the taxing. So they had a need of creating a new taxing. Why? Because they had a problem with the wealth they were collecting, extracting from America was not that big at the moment. They were having troubles with loans they were using to pay the different wars Spain as a country was part of. So they need to increase the amount of people paying taxes. So who were not paying taxes at the time? The nobility and the church, the Catholic Church of Spain. They needed to show some strength toward the nobility and the church. So that's why they decided to go against the Roma population. So that operation, which was a genocide, or at least intention of genocide, which is also a genocide, that operation failed because of the resistance of the Roma themselves, but also because of the support of the nobility of Spain. And you might wonder, how is that support? It's a surprise because suddenly the nobility people of Spain, and with that also the cultural producers of the moment, like theater, painters, they became somehow obsessed with the image of the Gitanos. So they became somehow gypsified. That led to creation of this fashion in which during the whole 19th century until maybe we could say until today, that image became so popular, so part of the image of Spain. They have to dress. They had to. The Roma themselves have to be part of that image. So, as I was saying, the reason behind the creation of this fashion was to show a response to the Enlightenment policies. So, to be Gitano would mean not to be Enlightenment, not to be European. So, to belong to the origin when things were done in the way things should be done. So, Roma in Spain at the time, 19th century, became a symbol of anti-Enlightenment policies. The decade of 1860s in certain cities of Spain witnessed what we nowadays call flamenco. So flamenco became a word that somehow meant Gitanos, but at the same time, it was kind of a new word to describe a new art form. How that happened? How can we have this word meaning Gitano that at the same time represent not only Gitanos but Andalusian and Spanish? So in this decade, there were a new venue in the Spanish cities, which was linked to the new bourgeois of Spain, called cafés cantantes, singing cafés. These places, these venues, would offer kind of variety shows in which you would have dancing, singing, and playing. But in these years, during this decade, it became so successful that it would offer a space for artists, Romani or not, to somehow be able to offer and create a new genre that has linked to previous art forms of Spain. So in these 10 years, we witnessed the creation of this art form in which Gitanos were protagonists of this creation. So we should not talk only about an art form that is belong to the Roma. We should make it more problematic, because we have to bear in mind that during 100 years, the image of the Gitanos of Spain became so present in the theater plays of the moment that even they, and when I say they, I mean the Spanish cultural producers, they created even a kind of theater called Teatro Gitanesco. And what is this? Imagine being a Gitano and assist to a theater play in which you would see gypsy characters, and I'm using precisely the word gypsy, not to refer to the Gitano real people. And these characters would perform a life which was supposed to be Roma. And you might wonder, how is that possible? So imagine that all the life of the Roma, all our stories were put plain inside. Like our stories, our life was part of the debate, of the public debate of Spain. So what people would think of Roma was informed, was present through these theatrical art forms, the Teatro Gitanesco. And we're talking about hundreds of theater plays with gypsy characters, gypsy stories, and even many of them were using a version of our language. So, and that's something that might be shocking for many people. Like how was possible that our language, our stories, our life was put on a stage, and that became part of the Spanish daily life. So as I see, one of the consequences of the general imprisonment of Gitanos, this 1749-1765 process, was the eradication of the traumatic memory of the Roma. Spanish Roma were somehow forbidden of using the very own word of Gitanos to define themselves in order to be accepted as citizens of Spain. So to be accepted as Spanish citizens, they would have to somehow forget what they went through. So the theater image of Gitanos of Spain was an answer to the traumatic experience of the Roma. The traumatic experience of the general imprisonment of Gitanos of 1749-1765 was forgotten and somehow replaced by a imaginary that was imposed on us through mainly theater and music. And how is that? Basically, we don't remember literally the story, the exact facts of the imprisonment, but we were imposed a form of life. So the Gypsy way of life, this thing that would become really known later in the avant-garde movement in European societies, at this time of Spain, during the whole 19th century, became like the national life. So Roma were somehow shown, were somehow imposed a memory that did not belong to us. So imagine being exposed to hundreds of theater plays in which Gitano characters living Gitano problems and very, very much obsessed with the life of our women and their honor. So imagine being exposed to this place during 150 years. Not only that, to these kind of stories and characters, but even the way they spoke in these theater plays. They were using our language or a version of our language, which is the caló. There are many of these theater plays in which the characters speak a kind of Andalusian Spanish with many of our words. So, and that was very, very common in Spain, and that became part of what later would be considered Andalusian or Spanish. But for us, that's the way I see. For us, that meant the substitution of a traumatic memory for a kind of happy life. A life that it is not our life. This visibility, this obsession with the visibility of the Romani lives in the theaters, in the theater plays of the 19th century Spain, these are not our stories. These are the way in which we have been put on stage.